Good evening. It is wonderful to see everyone this evening. Glad we can be together as always to study and hopefully to gain some more practical insights into how to share the gospel with others. If you remember last time, we looked at the second tactic, if you will, in the Columbo set of tactics in our book. We looked at this idea of reversing the burden of proof, talking about basically if someone makes a statement and then wants us to try and disprove it, well, that's not fair, and we don't have to buy it. If someone makes a statement, they are the ones who are responsible to back it up, to offer proof for their statement being true. And if I haven't made a statement yet, all I have to do is sit back and say, could you please help me understand how you came to that conclusion? That's the question, right? How did you come to that conclusion? Or we can vary it slightly depending on what exactly the topic is, as we talked about a little bit. We're going to kind of, after, I think we're probably a couple weeks out from this, but we're going to basically start practicing in a different way than we have before. Some of these ways of doing it, we're going to kind of almost have kind of a mock conversation back and forth kind of a thing. At least I'm going to try and pull that off if we can. So we're going to do that in a moment, or in a couple of times. Man, I can't talk tonight. A couple of weeks from now, just to kind of get a feel for that. But for right now, before we move on to a third tactic in the Columbo series, as the author does, I want us to stop for a moment. He devotes a whole chapter in between Columbo 2 and 3 to kind of give what he titles reliable rescues. And I will also title it that if the pointer works. Okay, reliable rescues. What we're talking about here, especially as we're using these first two tactics. So, what do you mean by that? Number one. How did you come to that conclusion? Number two. Questions we can ask in any kind of conversation. When we do that, not everyone's going to cooperate. We're not always going to be able to have an easy, straightforward, civil conversation with people, even when we're using these tactics. Now, these tactics are going to make it much easier. We're going to be much more effective in our conversations if we have this kind of mindset as we're going about this, but that doesn't mean that it's going to always be easy or that there won't be sometimes some obstacles. So, a couple of very common obstacles that people can run into with these kind of tactics we're going to talk about tonight just for a few minutes, and he also throws in a bonus in there as well for us. We're going to first talk about what he describes as the professor's ploy. Now, when we're talking about this, I want us to understand that the example he uses, a classroom example that we'll talk about in a moment, is not the only way this works. But I'll go ahead and use the example he uses, and then we'll kind of get a feel for how this can be expanded out. The example he uses is you are in a classroom setting, let's say in a college class, and your professor is very clearly and very openly not a fan of Christianity. Or maybe, as the case would be, not a fan of a specific teaching of Christianity, whatever. And they make this clear as they are speaking out in class and saying things and trying to make points that you clearly know are not true and are not biblical. And as you hear this, you just feel like you need to do something. For the sake of the other people in the classroom, you feel like you need to speak up somehow. Now, if you have been studying the book Tactics, your instinct, hopefully, is to ask questions rather than taking another approach. So maybe you start asking some questions. You start asking, as the professor makes a point, what do you mean by what you just said? And then they give some answer, and then you ask them, how did you come to that conclusion? And as the conversation continues, your professor may not be a smart man in the sense that he is biblically smart, but he is probably intelligent nonetheless, or she, and they might catch on to what you're doing. So what do? Well, rather, what are they going to do? If they catch on, it is very likely they're going to do something along this line. Well, you know what? Yeah, we've got a few minutes. Clearly, you disagree with what I'm saying. Why don't you come up here and you tell the class what you believe about this matter? Now, I want us to think about how this scenario can play out in general before we talk about the specifics. What are similar situations we might find ourselves in that may not be in a classroom? I don't imagine most of us find ourselves in classrooms, most people that are in this room. So what are some other situations similar to that where you might have someone standing in front of a group, let's say, or something along those lines, and have a similar situation play out?
Does it have to be a big group setting?
It doesn't have to be a group setting. Very good. You're thinking in the right direction.
Well, I was kind of thinking like, what if you try your question of like, well, how do you come to that conclusion? Then they turn around and say, well, obviously you don't agree with me. What do you think about it?
Okay, good. It could just be in a one-on-one conversation. Very good. If we're talking about them turning it around and saying, well, clearly you don't agree, why don't you say what you believe? Automatically, what are they doing? What have they done by asking you, well, why don't you tell me, tell us, if it's a group, tell us what you believe, tell me what you believe. Very good. What we just talked about last week, right? They made the statement, so they're the ones who need to be proving it. I may not have even told them what I believe yet. I've just been asking questions. Now, is it probably obvious to someone who's paying attention that I don't agree? Maybe. I do want to be as neutral as I can be with the questioning, at least to a certain point, because I am genuinely trying to understand where they're coming from. If I don't understand where they're coming from, we're not going to be able to go anywhere with the conversation. But if they try and turn it around like that, well, they're shirking their responsibility. But I do want to at least talk about his example in terms not necessarily of a group, and I appreciate Liz bringing that up, but in terms of someone who's in a position that I'm not. For example, let's say Facebook. If you get on Facebook and someone is saying something you don't agree with, a lot of times, where are they going to be saying those things? If someone says something on Facebook, wants to make their voice known, their opinion known, where are they going to say it on Facebook? Well, okay, good. They're going to say it, obviously they're not in person. A lot of times, they're going to make the points they want to make either on their own page or comment on someone else's idea or share someone else's idea and then comment. Common denominator being, in many cases, they have control over the medium in which they just made the statement. Let's use another example. I've actually done this before, not with a religious thing per se, but let's say you are listening to someone on the radio, like a talk radio situation. They say something that you want to comment on. Maybe it's not even something you disagree with. And so you call in, as the talk shows go, and you make a statement. Who controls the narrative in that situation? I'll give you a hint. It's not you. Even, let's say, for example, despite my best efforts, I say something that is incorrect as I'm standing up here in front of us all. And someone wants to make a comment and say, hey, what you said, that's not quite right. Now, I want to be the type of person who will listen to that. But understanding the dynamics of the room, who's in control of the room, just in terms of the dynamics of our conversation? The guy with the microphone. That's why I want to come back to the example that he uses as a professor. There are many situations that we're going to find ourselves in, just here and there. Sometimes, we could even say this, maybe I'm a guest at someone else's house. Well, guess who a lot of times has the reins of the conversation, even if I'm over at somebody else's house? Well, the person in whose house I am, right? I mean, after all, they have the right to kick me out if it comes to that. Hopefully it won't come to that. But whoever's in control of the conversation, especially if there's a group involved, or especially if there's a microphone or something like that, they have an advantage that I don't. Now, that's okay. That's not bad. But just for the sake of argument, leaving aside for a second the burden of proof aspect that we talked about last week, what happens if I get up in front of the class? I've been invited after all. He's given me time. I get up in front of the class and I try and present, here's what I believe. what happens at that point? Or maybe we should ask this. What does the other person get to do now?
Question you.
I have opened myself up to be at an unfair disadvantage. Because even if the professor lets me stand up in front of the classroom, in that example, I'm still not actually the one controlling the room. 9 times out of 10, you know what we call that? A trap. The professor is not letting you speak in front of the classroom. The radio host is not letting you speak to his audience. Whatever scenario we're talking about, the person on Facebook is not going to let you speak up to the point where you're going to cause damage to their position. They're setting you up to make you easier to shoot down. The point, when you find yourself in a situation like that, is don't fall for it. Now, that's hard. I want us to think if we were in one of those situations. Even let's throw another situation out there. Maybe, I don't know, you're in a small group setting of like some kind of meeting or whatever. Maybe like, I don't know, just small groups. Maybe you're getting together, do something for the community, and someone says something and you want to speak up. Any of these situations could work. The point is, whenever we put ourselves in a position to where the person who still controls the room is getting us up there to where we can be shot down, it's not that I don't have enough evidence. Don't get me wrong. It's not that I don't have something to show for what I believe. It's that I'm inherently giving someone else the upper hand when I ultimately don't have to, and I'm not responsible to. Let's use Jesus. Jesus is on the Pharisees' turf. The Pharisees say, "Tell us by what authority you are doing and saying these things." Translation, you're in our house, but we are graciously going to grant you the stage. You tell everyone by what authority you're doing this. What does Jesus do? Could he just get up and tell the truth? I'm not saying he didn't tell the truth, but could he just get up and just plainly say, here's where I get my authority. Here's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Of course he could have. Why didn't he? Because he smelled a trap. It is very, very tempting for us as Christians to fall for these kind of traps because we know we need to say something. But we have to say it in the right way where we're not being put at a disadvantage. Don't let people use the professor's ploy to put the burden of proof back on you. Not only is it their job to provide proof for what they have stated, but that puts you in a position where it looks like you're in more control, but now you actually have less control of the conversation. As we've talked about many, many times, one of the geniuses of Jesus' teaching style, he was always in control of the conversation. No matter how people tried to shift things around him. So if you're in a position, as Liz said, even if it's someone that's just a one-on-one conversation, someone tries to put this back on you, but especially if there's some way in which the other person is in the driver's seat of the room, don't fall for this. You want them to stay in the driver's seat so you can keep asking questions. And that's their job, after all. That's their job. If they're the one who controls the room, they're the one who we have a right to expect to answer our questions. You have every right. And now this goes to a context like this as well. If you're over another congregation visiting or something like that, something comes up, you have every right to expect a teacher to do their job. Don't do it for them. What that really is in disguise, hey, we have a few minutes, come up here and tell us what you think. What that actually is, whether they say it or not, they're wanting you to do their job. They're wanting you to address the issue so they don't have to. Now, they may not realize that's what they're doing. Most people in the room may not realize that's what they're doing. That's why we have to be very tactful in saying, I haven't even told you what I believe yet about the issue. I'm just asking a question. Could you, I'd love to share what I think, but first, could you help answer the question that I've asked? Even if they invite you, don't do it. Because they're setting you up. Questions on that one? Did I clarify what I was trying to communicate here? Okay. Let's move on to the next situation we might find ourselves in. This one is not generally going to be in a group setting, although it can be. This is the only viable image I could come up with for an interrogation room online. But I think we get the idea. When you watch, a spy movie or something like that, somebody's being interrogated. What do you picture? You picture them in this uncomfortable chair in an isolated room somewhere. Usually there's lights blaring in their face. They're being bombarded with all these questions, right? Have you ever been in a conversation that felt like that? You ever been in a conversation where, not necessarily even asking questions, people are just bombarding you with statements, even. For example, I remember one time, I don't remember where we were. I really don't remember where we were. But I think it was me and my mom and maybe one other person. And somehow, in a parking lot, we got cornered by some 9/11 is an inside job people. Now, I won't make any comments on that. I'll just leave it at that. But they are extremely obsessed with making sure everyone knows 9/11 was an inside job. Meaning the government actually caused 9/11 to happen, not the terrorists, blah, blah, blah. Okay? And they are just bombarding mom with all these things. Well, did you know about this? And did you hear about this? And well, this proves it, and this proves it. Mom didn't ask for that. Mom wasn't looking to find out more information about 9/11 conspiracy theories. None of that, right? Just kept on and on and on and on and on and on. The only way mom was really able to diffuse the situation was kind of changing the subject and then sneaking away. Okay? But a lot of conversations go like that, especially when you get in a conversation with certain types of people that disagree with you. Now, I say certain types of people very intentionally. I'm one of those types of people if I'm not careful, okay? If I get in a conversation with someone, my instinct a lot of times, well, but what about this? Well, what about this? Well, what about this? Well, what about this? And I just machine gun all my points out at once. If you're in a conversation with someone, you're trying to use what we've talked about, these tactics. You start asking questions. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? Whether they fully understand what you're doing or not, some people either just want to argue or just really, really, really feel like it's life or death to convince you that they're right. Either way, they just start going after your position, throwing all sorts of things at you, asking you all sorts of questions, all this kind of stuff. Now here's the deal. There are a lot of intelligent people in this room. None of us know everything. There are going to be times where you get in a conversation with someone and they start throwing stuff at you, you have no idea what they're talking about. They're throwing too many things at once, you can't follow it, what on earth am I supposed to do with this? It's actually a common tactic in debates sometimes too, whether you're talking about political debates, religious debates. People will throw 20 different problems at you in 1 minute, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to get you to answer each one before you move forward, which is almost impossible, and then it looks like you don't know what you're talking about. How do you think, or what do you think rather, would be the most effective way of handling a conversation where we've tried to use our tactics and we're just starting to get bombarded with facts, interrogations, all this kind of stuff, and we can barely get a word in edgewise? What do we do?
Hey, I go to the bathroom.
I love it. I love it. There is a sense, though, in which that is correct. In a sense. What is the least helpful thing to do in that kind of situation? Back at you, right? The least effective thing I can do in that situation, and unfortunately, many Christians are guilty of doing just this, the least effective thing you can do is try and answer every question, respond to every statement, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, escalate, 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 more and more and more and more and more. At this point, we're not going anywhere. We're not. I don't care if you can think quick enough that you can answer all their questions. At this point, we're not accomplishing anything. It's not helpful. So that's not what we need to do. We could just try and completely, okay, find an excuse, get me out of the situation, right? But we have an opportunity here. Again, using our tactics, we have an opportunity. Whenever I ask things like, how did you come to that conclusion? I'm no longer just gathering information, right? What I'm doing at that point is I'm beginning to sow the seeds to try and change their mind through my questions. I'm starting to try and force them to prove what they think, and ultimately, as we're going to talk about next time, I'm going to use all the information that I gather and all the things that I have learned that they're trying to use to prove their point. I'm going to use all that to try and make a point of my own, still through questions, but to try and make a point of my own. In other words, ultimately, my goal in a conversation, if I'm using my tactics, is what we've talked about before, to put a rock in their shoe. To make them think about something they haven't thought about before that they can't get rid of, and we'll go from there. If we start getting interrogated or bombarded or overwhelmed in a conversation, that's no longer our goal. If we start getting overwhelmed, that's when we switch. All of a sudden, I am no longer trying to convince them anymore. That's not to say they're being disingenuous. Sometimes that's just a personality thing. That's not to say I'm giving up on them. Again, there are many reasons why a conversation can go down this road. Instead, I'm just recognizing at this point where this conversation is, my goal no longer is to try and convince them of anything or put any rocks in their shoe because they're not listening anymore. They might listen later. So what am I going to do? All of a sudden now, I try and become a student. Now, my only goal, until I can go to the bathroom, my only goal is to try and take in what they're saying so that I can go and think about it and come back later and we can have a conversation that maybe is toned down a little more. To do that, I just need to be very honest and say, I'm really interested in all these things you're telling me, but you're going a little fast. Could you slow down so I can take this in, maybe even take notes? You want to make someone feel like, oh, wow, I really know what I'm talking about. Take notes of what they're telling you, right? Again, not being disingenuous. I'm genuinely trying to take in what they're telling me so that I can understand their position better. So stop making it at that point about trying to convince them of anything. Again, always convincing through questions still, but we're not even trying that at this point. We're going in a different direction now. I'm going to pivot and I'm just going to try and learn more. Now, that means I don't have to escalate a conversation. That means that I'm not risking a conflict that goes nowhere. That means I'm better equipping myself for our next conversation so that we can get somewhere. If you find yourself getting overwhelmed, give up on trying to persuade them for now, it's not forever. Switch to fact-finding mode. There are a ton of things you can learn if all you're doing is trying to just hear what they're saying. I'm not saying you're not doing that even in the other context when it's a more, what shall we say, a more calm conversation. You're still listening. You're still gathering information. That's our first question, right? But sometimes That's all you need to do, because anything else is just going to take the conversation in unhelpful directions. Once they've finished, thank them for their time, for their information, and ask them to give you some time to think about what they've said. Again, I'm not saying, well, everything you just said is hogwash, so let me figure out a way to defeat everything that you've said. That might be what you're thinking, but that's not the attitude we need to have. Our attitude should be, I want to think through what you said. Maybe I already know that there's flaws in it. Maybe I already know it's incorrect. Certainly I know their position's incorrect if we're talking about something that's not according to Scripture. But it's not going to help to try and take the conversation further down that road at this point. Just ask them for time to think about it and get back to them. Thoughts on that one? Have you ever found yourself in a situation like that before where you're being overwhelmed in a conversation? If it was me, I'm sorry. All right, one last thing, and we'll wrap up for the evening. This is the little bonus that he tags on there. Sometimes when you're having these conversations, people are not going to cooperate in a whole lot of different ways. Sometimes, as we've already said, they're going to try and reverse the burden of proof and put it back on you. Sometimes they're going to try and change the subject. Sometimes they're just going to start insulting you because they don't like what you're saying, but they don't have anything to respond. Anytime you find yourselves in those situations, something that he recommends that I really appreciate, just pause for a moment and state what just happened. Pause for a moment and just point out. Now hold on just a moment. Sorry, can I say something real quick? We were having a conversation, and now instead of talking about this thing we've kind of switched over here. I'm interested in talking about this too, but could we maybe come back and finish this conversation first? If they've changed the subject. Or, we've been having this conversation. Now, I've genuinely been enjoying learning your perspective, but I feel like now you're just attacking me. Could we maybe go back? I'm sorry if I've done something to offend you. That's not been my intention, but can we actually address the topic at hand? Especially, that can be useful if you are in, let's say, a group of people, and all of a sudden there's name-calling and stuff happening. Pointing out what's happened is very useful. In part, it's very useful because, as we've mentioned, I guess it was a few weeks ago, people don't know how to have conversations very well nowadays. And I don't mean that from a social perspective. I mean, people don't recognize things like, oh, attacking someone personally is not an effective argument. People just don't even recognize that. It's so part of our culture now. If you have a conversation with someone, it's normal now to change the subject or to throw out an insult or whatever, or to shift the burden of proof. That just happens all the time. People don't notice it, so point it out. Very kindly, not in an accusing way, not look what you just did, none of that. But just be very matter of fact. I noticed this just happened in our conversation. Can we pause for a second? I think this is what just happened. Let's try and get back to where we're going first, because I was really enjoying the conversation we were having. I was really learning a lot about what you think about this. Just point it out. Again, it's not something people are used to. It is something that usually people will be taken aback by, but you realize what you're doing in this process. You're not letting people take the conversation in a direction that it has no right to go. You're not letting something like a personal attack or changing the subject derail the conversation from the direction it needs to go. And if you do bring up, for example, this was kind of more directed at me. If there's something I've done, we can talk about that, but let's get back to the subject. And they just keep on insulting you. Well, that's when maybe it's okay. If you're just interested in I don't want a part of the conversation. I'd like to talk about the issue, but I don't think we're going anywhere at this point, right? Also very effective. So wrapping up, if you find yourself struggling while using your tactics, these are some tips It'll help you recover and re-engage. Not every conversation is going to go smoothly, even with the tactics that we're studying in this book. But here's some ways to recover, to find a workaround, if you will, if people try and put roadblocks in the way of the conversation. Ultimately, if people start sensing that they don't have a solid position or as solid a position as they thought, their instinct is going to be to try and change the subject, to try and reverse the burden of proof, or maybe even to lash out. That's kind of human nature. So we're going to find ourselves in these situations if we're using what we've been learning. And we have to be aware that there are ways, when people start pushing back, to keep on going and still keep the conversation very civil, very kind, but also on track. Any last thoughts or comments before we close? As always, if there is anything that we can do to encourage or pray for you this evening, we want to do that. This is a week that we're going to be spending time with family and friends and hopefully enjoying good fellowship, good conversation. There might be some times where some of the things we've been studying the last couple months come into play. There might be some conversations that come up that are difficult. I hope we will keep some of these concepts in mind as we are having those conversations and try and be as effective as we can be. We can know the truth, but if we don't present it or handle it in the right way, we won't be as effective. So hopefully these will help us in that. If there is anything that we can do to encourage or pray for you this evening, please let us know as we stand and sing together.